On March 9, 1974, a 62-year-old former bookseller named Yoshimi Taniguchi stepped off a small aircraft on Lubang Island in the Philippines, carrying a single order for a man who had been fighting World War II for 28 years, 6 months, and 8 days after Japan surrendered. Hiroo Onoda was the man waiting to receive that order, an Imperial Japanese Army intelligence officer who had spent nearly 3 decades in the jungle, convinced that every newspaper, every leaflet, and every loudspeaker appeal from his own family was an elaborate enemy trick. Insane, he was not. Lost, he was not either. What he was doing was executing the precise training he'd received at a secret military academy built to produce soldiers who would rather distrust the enemy's information than believe it, and that distinction between fanaticism and doctrine runs through this entire story. This was a war that, for one man, never ended in 1945. It ended on a tropical island airstrip in 1974, when his own commanding officer flew across the world and across 29 years just to tell him to stop. By the time that order finally arrived, the cost of the wait had already been paid, and not by Onoda. The civilians of the island, he never stopped fighting on, paid it instead. To understand why Hiroo Onoda kept fighting for 29 years, you need to understand what kind of soldier the Imperial Japanese Army deliberately built him to be, because Onoda was never standard infantry. He graduated from the Nakano School, the Japanese Army's secret intelligence and unconventional warfare academy, founded in Tokyo's Nakano district in 1938 under the deliberately bland cover designation Eastern 33rd Unit. Somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 trained operatives passed through that school over the course of its operation, instructed in espionage, sabotage, propaganda, counterintelligence, survival, camouflage, and unconventional combat. The main Tokyo campus wasn't where Onoda trained. His instruction happened at the Futamata branch, a satellite school opened in September 1944 in what's now Tenryu Ward, Hamamatsu, in Shizuoka Prefecture, built specifically to produce guerrilla operators for the war's final, most desperate phase. The timing tells its own story. By the autumn of 1944, the Imperial High Command no longer had the luxury of long training pipelines, and courses originally planned to run 2 full years got compressed first to 6 months. Then, for Onoda's specific cohort, down to roughly 3 months. Around 220 men graduated in that first Futamata class, Onoda among them, on or near September 1, 1944. Here's the single most important fact in this entire story, a detail almost nobody outside specialist military history circles knows. Nakano School doctrine inverted the standard Japanese military code of the era. Death before the dishonor of capture was the prevailing battlefield ethic across the rest of the Imperial Army, the Senjinkan, but Futamata graduates received the opposite instruction. Suicide was forbidden under any circumstances. Capture was to be endured if it ever came to that, and staying alive and operational for as long as it took mattered more than anything else, because a dead intelligence officer is strategically worthless, while a captured one who keeps feeding the enemy false information remains a weapon. Historian Stephen Mercado documents this doctrinal reversal directly in his study of the school, titled The Shadow Warriors of Nakano. Onoda welcomed the order, by his own account in his memoir. He liked it. It freed him from the suicidal logic governing the rest of the Imperial Army's conventional units, replacing that logic with something quieter and, as it would turn out, far more dangerous. Explicit permission to keep operating indefinitely, with no built-in end condition except a direct, verified order from a superior officer standing physically in front of him. Survive at all costs. Distrust everything that isn't your own chain of command in person. That single design choice is the entire mechanism behind everything that follows. The Futamata curriculum covered more than just guerrilla warfare and sabotage, and none of it was incidental. Espionage, tradecraft, propaganda construction, counter-propaganda analysis, counterintelligence, camouflage, long-term survival, weapons handling, and, most tellingly, philosophy and history alongside martial arts all made the syllabus. The CIA's own internal historical review of the Nakano School, published decades later in its Studies in Intelligence series, noted that the school's methods were consciously modeled on the discipline of feudal-era ninja operatives, men trained to operate alone behind enemy lines for extended periods without external support or verification. Onoda wasn't simply handed a rifle and a vague patriotic slogan. He was handed an entire intellectual framework for distinguishing legitimate information from enemy deception, one that treated isolation itself as a survivable, even expected, operating condition rather than a crisis to be resolved quickly. Wakayama Prefecture is where Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in the village of Kamekawa, into a family with samurai ancestry. His father had served as a cavalry sergeant in the Imperial Army during the Second Sino-Japanese War in China and was killed there. At 17, in 1939, Onoda left home to work at a branch of the Taijima Yoko Trading Company in Hankow, in occupied China, an early and unromantic exposure to life under Japanese occupation, years before he ever put on a military uniform himself. Conscription into the Imperial Japanese Army came in 1942, when he was 20. 2 years later, the Nakano School's Futamata course selected him, a clear signal that the Army had identified him as intelligence officer material rather than conventional infantry. December 26, 1944, was the date he was dispatched to Lubang Island in the Philippines, attached to the Special Intelligence Squadron of the 14th Area Army under Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, operating in the area of the 8th Division under Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama. His orders were specific and concrete: destroy the island's airstrip and its harbor pier, and organize ongoing guerrilla resistance against any Allied landing force. That sabotage mission never got finished. His own superior officers stationed on Lubang overruled him and blocked the demolition of both the airfield and the pier before American and Philippine Commonwealth forces landed on the island on February 28, 1945. Lubang fell within days. Onoda and 3 other soldiers retreated into the island's rugged, mountainous interior, and that retreat became the opening move of a war that, for these 4 men, wouldn't have a closing move for nearly 30 years. There's a modern systems design parallel worth sitting with here. Onoda's training prioritized indefinite operational survival over a clean, defined end state, which is the same underlying design philosophy that separates a fragile system from an anti-fragile one in modern risk engineering. A fragile system breaks the moment conditions shift outside its expected range, while an anti-fragile one keeps functioning under prolonged uncertainty precisely because it was never given a fixed termination point to begin with. Onoda's superiors built him, quite deliberately, to survive total collapse. What none of them anticipated was that the collapse in question would be the collapse of the entire war effort itself, and that the system they'd engineered to survive anything would simply keep running, with no mechanism to recognize its own obsolescence. Onoda's own memoir records his reaction to receiving these orders in late 1944, and it's worth hearing close to his own words, because it shows a young officer actively choosing total commitment rather than passively accepting an assignment handed down to him. "I'll do it," he recalled telling his superiors. "Even if I don't have coconuts, even if I have to eat grass and weeds, I'll do it. These are my orders, and I will carry them out." A reluctant conscript being pushed into an impossible mission, this was not. A 22-year-old intelligence officer, fresh out of an elite training program, explicitly embracing the most extreme version of the doctrine he'd just spent months absorbing. That's what this was. The man who would still be following that exact mindset 29 years later was already fully formed in that one sentence, months before he ever set foot on Lubang Island. 4 men vanished into Lubang's interior in early 1945. Onoda, the senior officer and the only one with intelligence school training, alongside Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka. Lubang itself isn't a large island, roughly 25 to 30 kilometers east to west, with rugged cliffs and isolated fishing beaches along its southern half that made decades of sustained concealment genuinely possible. Around 12,000 people lived there at the time, mostly farmers and fishermen with no particular stake in a war that, as far as they understood it, had already ended. Japan's formal surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, and signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd of that year, and Onoda didn't believe any of it. The group encountered their first piece of evidence that the war might be over in October 1945, a leaflet reading, in essence, that the war had ended on August 15th and instructing them to come down from the mountains. They dismissed it outright as Allied propaganda. A more specific and theoretically more credible leaflet got airdropped onto the island later that same year, this one bearing the actual surrender order issued by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the 14th Area Army Zone commander, the man at the literal top of Onoda's chain of command. They rejected that one too. Simple stubbornness, this is not, and treating it that way misses the actual mechanism at work. A trained intelligence officer applying his own doctrine exactly as it was taught to him. That's what's happening here. Distrust enemy-sourced information categorically and assume it's disinformation until directly countermanded by verified contact with your own chain of command. The doctrine worked. The problem was that nobody had built an expiration date into it, and nobody had specified what form of evidence would ever be sufficient to override it short of a facito-face order from a named superior. It's worth pausing on just how thoroughly Onoda was cut off from any legitimate version of that chain of command almost immediately. General Yamashita, the officer whose own signed surrender order Onoda dismissed as fake in late 1945, commanded the entire 14th Area Army across the Philippines theater, the same general who, amid the broader collapse of Japanese resistance across the islands that year, was overseeing the surrender of hundreds of thousands of troops elsewhere in the archipelago. Lieutenant General Yokoyama, the 8th Division commander who'd personally issued Onoda's Live on Coconuts order, was already deceased by the time of Onoda's eventual 1974 surrender, which meant that even if Onoda had wanted direct verification from the specific officer who gave him his original orders, that path had been closed for years without his knowledge. Taniguchi was the only member of his actual chain of command still alive and reachable by 1974, which is precisely why Taniguchi, and only Taniguchi, turned out to be the man capable of ending the holdout when the moment finally came. September 1949 brought the first crack in the Foreman group when Akatsu separated from the other three, apparently unable to continue under the same conditions. 6 months later, in March 1950, he surrendered to Philippine forces. The remaining 3 men didn't interpret this as a reasonable, understandable choice made by an exhausted man. Desertion is what they called it, and worse, an active security risk, since Akatsu now knew their hiding patterns, their movement habits, and their general operating area, and could, in their minds, be feeding that information directly back to what they still believed was an active occupying enemy force. From that point forward, the surviving 3 grew markedly more cautious, more isolated, and more committed to the original mission. The Japanese government tried a different approach entirely in February 1952. Photographs and letters from the men's own families got airdropped directly onto the island. Onoda later wrote about the moment he looked at those photographs, and his reaction, in his own words, was that the Yankees had outdone themselves this time. He found himself genuinely wondering how on earth American intelligence had obtained such convincing fakes. 3 remaining soldiers stared at pictures of their own mothers, fathers, and siblings and concluded, without apparent hesitation, that this was simply a more sophisticated version of the same trick. This is, in its own way, the clearest possible illustration of how completely the Nakano School's doctrine had taken hold. The philosophy he carried through those years, Onoda described as a kind of integrity, and in his own telling, in his memoir, he defined that word specifically: sincerity, loyalty, devotion to duty, and a sense of personal morality, all of which, in his account, allowed a man to withstand all hardships and ultimately turn hardship itself into victory. One of his instructors had put the underlying idea even more plainly. He recalled, "If you're genuinely pure in spirit, people will respond to you and cooperate with you." A coherent, Even admirable-sounding ethical framework in the abstract, that's what this was. Applied without an exit condition, over decades, in total isolation, it became the exact mechanism that let a man look directly at photographs of his own family and conclude they were fabricated. Akatsu's fate deserves a second look here, because his case is the clearest available natural experiment inside this story. He separated from the other three in September 1949 and surrendered to Philippine forces 6 months later, after roughly 6 months alone, and he didn't face anything resembling Onoda's later ordeal. He simply walked out, got processed, and resumed an ordinary post-war life. Nothing about his surrender triggered any catastrophic consequence for him personally. And yet Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka responded to his departure not by reconsidering their own situation, but by tightening their operational discipline and treating Akatsu himself as a security threat. The doctrine wasn't simply resistant to outside evidence. It actively converted a peer's successful, consequence-free surrender into further confirmation that staying hidden remained the correct choice, a closed loop reinforcing itself from the inside, with no external input capable of breaking it short of the one specific trigger the system had been built to wait for. By June 1953, the group's prolonged isolation had already produced real, lethal violence, not against an opposing army, but against the island's unarmed civilian population. Corporal Shimada was wounded in the leg during a shootout with local fishermen that same month, and Onoda nursed him back to health over the following weeks. He didn't have long to recover. May 7, 1954, is when Shimada was killed in a shootout with a Philippine Army mountain unit that stumbled onto the group's position near the beach at Gontan during a routine training exercise, not a planned operation against them, but a chance encounter that ended his life regardless. Onoda and Kozuka were now down to 2 men, alone against an island they'd been concealing themselves on for 9 years. The Japanese government formally declared Hiroo Onoda legally dead in 1959. That same year, a major search expedition went out, including a direct appeal broadcast over a loudspeaker by Onoda's own brother, Toshio, calling out across the jungle for his missing sibling, and it failed completely. 3 separate formal Japanese search efforts were conducted across the full span of the holdout, involving more than 100 people combined and costing roughly 90 million yen in total, and every single one of them came back having found nothing. For comparison, when a young Japanese traveler finally did locate Onoda in 1974, it took him 4 days. The terrain itself was part of what made those professional searches fail so consistently. Lubang's southern half is dominated by rugged cliffs and isolated fishing beaches, with the island's highest point rising to roughly 352 meters and a coastline running approximately 100 kilometers around its perimeter. A trained intelligence officer who understood exactly how search parties would be organized, what patterns they'd follow, and what assumptions they'd carry into the jungle had, in effect, a permanent home field advantage against any search effort built around conventional military logic. The same island supporting roughly 12,000 farmers and fishermen going about ordinary civilian life also contained more than enough uninhabited, near-impassable terrain to swallow one man indefinitely, provided he never made the kind of mistake that would let a search party's assumptions actually intersect with his real location. That gap is worth sitting with, because it maps onto a search and detection asymmetry that shows up constantly in modern cybersecurity threat hunting, where a well-funded, institutionally organized defense can spend years and a great deal of money failing to locate a single, low-signature, deeply embedded actor who simply refuses to behave the way the search model assumes he will. 90 million yen and more than 100 trained searchers, against one man who understood, because his own training had taught him to understand it, exactly what assumptions those searchers were operating under, and how to remain invisible to them. The 2-man unit of Onoda and Kozuka continued for over a decade beyond that failed 1959 search. By 1965, more than 20 years into the holdout, Onoda had looted a transistor radio from a village raid, a detail he included in his own memoir, without apparently recognizing how damaging it would later look against his central claim of total isolation from outside information. With that radio, he was able to receive broadcasts that included an Australian agricultural program and, in 1969, live coverage of the Apollo moon landing, according to multiple accounts. A man tuning into real-time radio coverage of American astronauts walking on the surface of the moon had functioning access to a world that had moved spectacularly, undeniably forward since 1945, and he kept operating exactly as before regardless. Two purposes combined in the act that finally ended this phase of the holdout. On October 19, 1972, Kozuka was killed by local police while he and Onoda were burning a village's freshly harvested rice. Random destruction, this was not. In their operational logic, it served simultaneously as economic sabotage against the local population and as a deliberate signal, fires set specifically to be visible, intended to alert any returning Japanese forces that organized resistance on Lubang remained active. Here's a small but telling detail. Even 27 years after the war's actual end, with a working radio capable of receiving lunar broadcasts sitting in his own possession, Onoda and his last remaining subordinate were still coordinating tactical signals meant for an imperial Japanese military that no longer existed in any form capable of receiving them. After 18 years as Onoda's closest companion and last remaining subordinate, Kozuka was gone, and Hiroo Onoda was now, for the first time since December 1944, completely alone on the island. Before moving to how this story gets interpreted, the sheer logistics of staying alive on Lubang Island for 29 years deserve a pause, because the level of discipline involved is itself part of the evidence for who Onoda actually was. He and his men built seasonal shelters matched precisely to the island's climate, palm leaf and vine huts, each taking roughly 7 to 8 hours to construct. Used during the wet season from July through October, switching to army tents during the dry months. All his drinking water got boiled without exception across the entire holdout, and there was no malaria on Lubang, which means that habit alone likely prevented the kind of illness that ended other holdouts' lives early. His Arisaka rifle got cleaned daily, every single day, for nearly 30 years, which is the direct reason it was still fully functional when he finally surrendered it in 1974. Bananas, coconuts, and rice taken from village stores made up most of his food, eaten sparingly because hulling rice by hand was difficult without proper equipment. The group periodically killed villagers' cattle, timed deliberately for evening hours or during rainstorms to muffle the gunshot, and a single cow yielded roughly 250 pieces of dried meat, rationed at approximately 1 piece per day to make it last. Eating too much fresh meat at once gave him a fever, Onoda later noted, a small, almost clinical detail that speaks to just how precisely he had to manage his own body over decades of marginal nutrition. He said, by his own account, that across his entire 30 years on Lubang, he never once slept soundly through an entire night. A man drifting through delusion, this was not. A man running an extremely tight, self-imposed survival operation, every single day, for 3 decades, against an island that wanted him gone and a war that had already ended. That's what this actually was. This is where the conventional version of this story usually stops examining itself, and where this account won't. The popular narrative, the one told in Onoda's own best-selling 1974 memoir, the one repeated in most retrospectives and most casual retellings, frames him as a tragic, almost noble figure. A soldier so disciplined, so unbreakably loyal, that 29 years of mounting evidence simply couldn't reach him. That narrative is incomplete, and the people who've studied the case most closely now increasingly believe it's wrong in a specific and deeply uncomfortable way. Onoda's own ghostwriter, a man named Suda Shin, who worked directly alongside him to produce No Surrender, My 30-Year War, later published a separate and far more critical account of his own. Onoda knew, at some point well before 1974, that the war was over, and kept killing anyway. Suda argues directly and unambiguously. The evidence Suda and subsequent researchers point to centers on that transistor radio Onoda admitted, in his own memoir, to looting from a village in 1965, a radio he then used, according to multiple accounts, to listen to outside broadcasts that included an Australian agricultural program and live coverage of the 1969 Apollo moon landing. A man capable of tuning in to real-time coverage of American astronauts walking on the lunar surface is, by any reasonable standard, not a man whose worldview remains frozen at 1945-era information levels. Historian Beatrice Trefalt, whose scholarship on Japanese Army stragglers across the Pacific is among the most cited in the field, reaches a closely related conclusion through a more clinical lens. Onoda later claimed publicly that he didn't know the war was over, she notes, yet he plainly had access to newspapers, and he was carrying a working transistor radio. Arthur Harari, the French director who'd go on to make a major film about Onoda's life nearly 5 decades later, arrived at a similar judgment after years spent researching the man directly. The real Onoda, in Harari's own words, was considerably scarier than the legend, closer, he concluded, to a sociopath than to a tragic, misunderstood hero. The explanation that he genuinely had no way of knowing doesn't survive contact with the radio, the broadcasts, and his own ghostwriter's testimony, which leaves institutional momentum operating inside a doctrine that never specified a stopping condition in the first place as the more honest frame, not ignorance. Onoda was trained, explicitly and deliberately, to treat enemy-sourced information as inherently untrustworthy by default, and to wait specifically for direct, verified, in-person contact with his own chain of command before standing down. Whatever Onoda privately suspected or even quietly believed about the war's actual status at any given point, that training gave him a closed, internally consistent logical loop. No direct order from Taniguchi or Yokoyama meant the original mission remained technically active, full stop, regardless of what an Apollo broadcast or an Australian farm report might have suggested to him in private. The doctrine wasn't malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as it had been designed to function. It simply had no off switch built into it, and Onoda, whatever his private doubts may have been, repeatedly chose institutional obedience to an unverifiable standing order over independent judgment for 29 consecutive years. That choice carried a cost, and it wasn't paid by Onoda. It was paid, in blood, by the people of Lubang Island. The framing of him as a fanatic who simply couldn't process new information is itself a kind of comfortable myth, and it's worth being precise about why. A genuine fanatic, by definition, would act erratically, inconsistently, driven by belief rather than calculation. What the documented record actually shows is a man capable of disciplined daily routines across nearly 3 decades, boiling all his drinking water without fail, maintaining a functional rifle through 30 years of jungle humidity, rationing dried meat by the piece, building seasonal shelters matched precisely to the wet and dry seasons, and reasoning carefully enough about ambush geometry to wait for multiple targets to line up before firing. That's not the behavioral profile of an irrational man lost in delusion. It's the behavioral profile of a highly capable operator continuing to execute a coherent operational doctrine indefinitely, in the total absence of the one specific input, verified, in-person contact from his chain of command, that his training had defined as the only legitimate trigger for standing down. This is the part of the Onoda story that gets cut from most retellings, and it shouldn't be, because leaving it out is itself a form of distortion. Filipino civilians on Lubang were killed and wounded in repeated skirmishes with Onoda's group over the course of the holdout. The figure most consistently reported, drawn from post-war interviews with islanders and from Philippine police and constabulary records compiled in the years following 1974, sits at approximately 30 people killed and more than 100 wounded. Onoda himself reportedly gave inconsistent figures over the years when pressed, at times stating no less than 30, and according to his ghostwriter Suda, at other points suggesting a number closer to 130. These weren't soldiers engaged in combat. farmers tending fields, fishermen working the coastline, ordinary residents of an island with no operational connection whatsoever to the war. Onoda believed he was still fighting. That's who these casualties actually were. Documentary filmmaker Mia Stewart, an Australian-Filipino researcher who spent roughly 15 years investigating the Lubang side of this story for a project titled Searching for Onoda, holds at least 6 official Filipino death certificates directly tied to these killings. Her own great-uncle, a farmer named Emilio Viano, was among the dead, shot in the thigh while working a sweet potato field alongside his 2 sons, Pertatio and Diani, the bullet severing an artery. He bled out as his sons rowed him toward the nearest settlement, Tubuhan, in a desperate attempt to get him help, and both sons were also wounded in the same attack, but survived. The exact year of Emilio Viano's death is disputed across the available reporting, with some accounts placing it in 1951 and others in 1961, a discrepancy that hasn't been definitively resolved in the public record, though the day and month, the eve of his birthday, are consistent across every version of the account. Other documented cases carry names too, and each one deserves to be said plainly rather than folded into an anonymous total. Pelagio Tagle, known locally as Iong, was killed in 1964 while napping in a field hut roughly 2 kilometers from town, found decapitated, with the surrounding fields deliberately set on fire. His daughter Estelita was 6 years old at the time of his death, and her mother later went blind. Rafael Canals was killed in an incident formally documented in a Philippine police report, and his son, local official Bernardo Canals, gave testimony about the killing decades later, before his own death during the COVID-19 pandemic. Francisco Villar was killed in front of his own young grandson, a death certificate for which Stewart later obtained directly. Among the survivors of these encounters are Candido Tria, who carried his wounds for the remainder of his life and was, decades later, embraced by Onoda himself during his 1996 return visit to the island, and Ricardo Núñez, who was left with a permanent limp. Mia Stewart's own account of why she began this research nearly 15 years ago is worth stating directly, in her own framing rather than paraphrased into something softer. She believes Onoda actually knew the war was over early on, that he continued to engage in guerrilla warfare regardless, terrorizing the island, and that civilians became victims of his delusion and his continued violence. And she states this plainly while also conceding, with the same honesty, that this conclusion can't be definitively proven from the available evidence. That combination, a strong personal conviction stated openly, paired with an explicit acknowledgement of its evidentiary limits, is a more rigorous standard than most of the popular retellings of this story have ever applied to Onoda's own version of events, which has been repeated for decades largely without that same scrutiny. Almost none of this victim-side research existed in any organized, English-language, broadly accessible form until Stewart began compiling it. For nearly 4 decades after 1974, the version of this story available to most of the world was effectively the version Onoda himself chose to tell. Onoda's own description of his ambush method, according to Suda's account, drawn from years of direct conversation with Onoda while ghostwriting his memoir, was tactical and deliberate, not the panicked improvisation of a confused soldier reacting in fear. He reportedly described waiting deliberately for villagers to line up so that a single rifle round could strike more than one person at once, reasoning that it would be wasteful to use one bullet on a single target when groups of 3 or 4 routinely walked the same paths together. It was clearly a murder, Suda's blunt conclusion runs, after years spent working alongside the man whose story made him internationally famous. At least it was not a fight. The islanders had no intention to kill. That account is worth placing directly against Onoda's own published explanation for why he refused suicide even in moments of extreme personal danger throughout the holdout. Better, he wrote in his memoir, to kill one more enemy with his very last bullet than to take his own life. The doctrine that kept him alive for 29 years was explicitly and deliberately structured around continued lethal engagement as a default behavior, not passive, defensive survival, and that detail rarely makes it into the heroic version of this story. Of roughly 30 civilians, examined the surviving police reports or heard testimony from the families involved. The pardon functioned, by most informed readings of the event, primarily as a diplomatic gesture, a way to cement and stabilize Japan-Philippines relations at a moment when Japan had already paid huge post-war reparations to the Philippine government, reported in the range of $550 million. Local authorities on Lubang reportedly had to actively restrain residents who wanted to physically confront Onoda before he could be flown off the island on the day of the surrender itself. The timing of that pardon deserves a moment, because diplomatic context explains a decision that, viewed purely on its own terms, looks almost incomprehensible. By 1974, Japan and the Philippines had spent nearly 2 decades rebuilding a relationship shattered by wartime occupation, and that relationship rested on a foundation of formal reparations and continued economic cooperation. A Filipino president publicly prosecuting a Japanese national for wartime-adjacent killings, only 3 decades after the broader war itself, risked reopening exactly the kind of bilateral wound both governments had spent years trying to close. Marcos's pardon wasn't a judgment about whether the killings had occurred or about their severity. It was a calculation that the diplomatic cost of prosecution outweighed the moral cost of letting it go unexamined, a calculation made entirely by 2 national governments, with the people of Lubang Island holding no seat at that table whatsoever. Japan also extended approximately 300 million yen toward the Philippines in the years following the surrender, redirected specifically into educational and cultural programs rather than structured as direct compensation to the individual families affected by the holdout. None of that sum was ever distributed as formal restitution to the Vianu, Tagle, Canals, or Viller families. By early 1974, Hiroo Onoda had been completely alone on Lubang Island for nearly a year and a half since Kozuka's death the previous October. The man who finally found him wasn't a soldier, a diplomat, or a trained professional searcher of any kind. Norio Suzuki was his name, a 24-year-old Japanese university dropout who'd left Hosei University's economics program and set out on a self-directed journey with 3 stated goals. In his own explicit order of priority: find Lieutenant Onoda, find a panda, find the abominable snowman. He located Onoda on February 20th, 1974, after just 4 days of searching an island that had successfully defeated professional Japanese government search expeditions for nearly 3 decades. Suzuki talked with him directly. Years later, in a 2010 interview, Onoda described the encounter himself, recalling that this hippie boy Suzuki came to the island to listen to the feelings of a Japanese soldier, and that Suzuki had asked him plainly why he wouldn't simply come out of hiding. There's a small, genuinely telling detail buried in Onoda's own memoir about how he first identified Suzuki as Japanese rather than as a local islander who might be approaching with hostile intent. Suzuki was wearing socks. No local islander capable of affording socks would wear them without also owning shoes to go with them, Onoda reasoned, based on years of close observation of Lubang's residents, and that single, almost absurd detail of clothing, not the conversation itself, not Suzuki's explanation, not any document he carried, was what convinced Onoda the man in front of him might genuinely be who he claimed to be. He later admitted plainly that if Suzuki hadn't happened to be wearing socks that day, he might have simply shot him on sight before any conversation could happen at all. Suzuki's discovery alone wasn't sufficient to end the holdout, though. Onoda told him directly and unambiguously that he wouldn't surrender to anyone except his actual commanding officer, delivered in person. The doctrine held even here, in what would turn out to be the final days of the war for him. No verbal account from a stranger, no photograph, no radio broadcast, no newspaper article, only direct, face-to-face, verified contact with his own named chain of command would satisfy the standing order he'd carried since December 1944. So Suzuki flew back to Japan, found the national government, and the government in turn located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, by then a 62-year-old civilian working an ordinary life as a bookseller, who hadn't worn an Imperial Japanese Army uniform in nearly 30 years. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi flew to Lubang Island and stood, in person, in front of the man he'd once commanded. Norio Suzuki's own story deserves a moment here, because it ended almost as strangely as the one he'd just finished writing into history. Having found Onoda, he'd completed only the first of his 3 stated goals. He went on, in the years following, to actually locate a wild panda, checking off the second item on his self-assigned list. The third goal, he never got the chance to complete. Suzuki died in a Himalayan avalanche in the Dhaulagiri Range while searching for the abominable snowman, and his body was eventually recovered around 1987. A 24-year-old dropout who succeeded where a 90 million yen government search effort had failed for nearly 3 decades ultimately died, chasing the one goal on his list that was never going to be found at all. It's a strange, almost unbearably fitting epilogue to a man whose entire approach to the world was built on going looking for things everyone else had already decided weren't really there. What Taniguchi had originally told Onoda back in 1944 had been close to this. He was absolutely forbidden to die by his own hand under any circumstances. It might take 3 years, it might take 5, but whatever happened, the army would come back for him eventually. And so long as he had even a single soldier remaining under his command, he was to keep leading that soldier, even if it meant living on nothing but coconuts. Onoda's own memoir attributes a closely related version of this same standing order to his division commander at the time, General Yokoyama. As long as he had one soldier remaining, he was to lead him, even if the 2 of them had to survive on coconuts indefinitely. Now, on a runway on Lubang Island, almost 30 years after those words were first spoken, that same chain of command stood directly in front of him again, the only category of evidence Onoda's training had ever recognized as legitimate, and formally relieved him of duty. Hiroo Onoda wept, and he accepted the order immediately. The following day, March 10, 1974, he formally surrendered to Philippine forces at Lubang's radar base. He turned over his ceremonial sword, his Type 99 Arisaka rifle, still fully functional after nearly 30 years of continuous use and maintenance in the jungle, 500 rounds of live ammunition, several hand grenades, and a dagger his own mother had given him back in 1944, intended specifically for his own death if he were ever captured by the enemy. He never used it, not once, across 29 years. Asked afterward what had been going through his mind across those decades, his answer was simple and direct. Nothing but accomplishing his duty. On March 11, 1974, Hiroo Onoda was flown to Manila for a formal ceremony at Malacanang Palace, where he presented his sword directly to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who granted him a complete and unconditional pardon on the spot. No investigation into the documented killings on Lubang Island was ever opened as part of that pardon, as already noted. The reaction within the Philippines, and specifically on Lubang itself, stood in sharp and immediate contrast to the reaction in Manila and in Tokyo. Onoda returned to Japan on March 12, 1974, greeted by large, celebratory crowds at the airport, a homecoming that bore almost no resemblance to how he was simultaneously being remembered on the island he'd just left behind, where residents had needed to be physically restrained from confronting him only days earlier. This gap, between 2 entirely simultaneous and almost totally incompatible receptions of the exact same man, is itself a pattern worth naming directly, because it isn't unique to this case. It's the same pattern visible today whenever an organization's internal narrative about a controversial decision and the narrative held by the people directly harmed by that decision diverge so completely that they appear to be describing 2 entirely different events. Tokyo received a returning hero. Lubang was left with an unpunished, pardoned man walking free, having killed roughly 30 of their own. Both descriptions are factually accurate accounts of the same March 1974 event. Neither side was wrong about what they personally experienced. Hiroo Onoda's reintegration into Japanese civilian society proved difficult almost immediately. He found post-war Japan deeply disorienting to live in, materialist by his own assessment, fully demilitarized, and to his eyes nearly unrecognizable compared to the values he'd spent 29 years actively preserving in the jungle. In April 1975, just over a year after his formal surrender, he emigrated to Brazil, settling in Trinos, in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, where he became a working cattle rancher on a property in the Colonia Jamek settlement. He married a woman named Machi in 1976. He remained in Brazil for nearly a decade before a single news story redirected the entire remainder of his life. In 1980, he read about a Japanese teenager who'd murdered his own parents with a baseball bat in Kanagawa Prefecture. The story disturbed him enough that he made the deliberate decision to return to Japan and dedicate the rest of his life to teaching young people resilience and the capacity to overcome hardship, values he believed post-war Japanese society had stopped instilling in its youth. He formally returned in 1984 and founded the Onoda Nature School in Fukushima Prefecture, a structured survival and character program for children and young adults, and from that point forward split his time between Japan and Brazil for the remainder of his life. There's something worth pausing on in the specific choice he made here. Onoda didn't respond to a single act of domestic violence by reflecting on the costs of unbending discipline pushed past the point of usefulness, the exact lesson his own life might have suggested. Instead, he decided that Japanese youth needed more of precisely the qualities his own training had instilled in him: endurance, self-reliance, the capacity to function under hardship without external support. The same psychological framework that kept him fighting a war that no longer existed for 29 years became, in his own mind, the solution to a completely unrelated social problem decades later. Whether that consistency reflects genuine, hard-won wisdom about resilience, or reflects a man who never actually revised the core operating system his training had installed in him back in 1944, is a judgment this account is going to leave open rather than answer for you. In 1996, he made the deliberate choice to return to Lubang Island itself, donating a $10,000 scholarship fund to a local school during the visit. The reception, once again, split sharply along the same lines as it had in 1974. Roughly 50 relatives of his victims gathered to protest the visit directly, while the local town council formally asked him to compensate the families of those he and his men had killed during the holdout. He never offered that compensation. He did receive a number of formal honors in Brazil over his later years, including the Santos Dumont Merit Medal, awarded by the Brazilian Air Force in December 2004 for allowing the Air Force to use his ranch land for training exercises, and honorary citizenship from the Legislative Assembly of Mato Grosso do Sul, granted in February 2010. Hiroo Onoda died of heart failure resulting from pneumonia on January 16, 2014, at St. Luke's International Hospital in Tokyo, at the age of 91. His memorial service was held at Yasukuni Shrine. Here's a detail that almost never makes it into the popular telling of this story, and it matters a lot. Hiroo Onoda wasn't, in fact, the final Japanese holdout to surrender after World War II. That distinction belongs to a man named Taro Nakamura, born at Tunpalawan, an ethnic Amos Taiwanese soldier who'd served in the Imperial Japanese Army's Takasago Volunteer Unit. Nakamura was arrested on the Indonesian island of Morotai on December 18, 1974, more than 9 months after Onoda's own surrender on Lubang. The way post-war Japan treated these two men afterward exposes something the heroic Onoda narrative conveniently leaves out entirely. Onoda came home to massive welcoming crowds, a best-selling memoir, national celebrity, and an enduring legacy. Nakamura, as a colonial subject from Taiwan rather than an ethnic Japanese citizen, wasn't entitled to a standard Japanese military pension under the law as it then stood. Initial reporting at the time of his surrender calculated his total back pay, after decades of unpaid service, at the equivalent of roughly $227. A sustained public outcry eventually forced the Japanese government to offer him 3.5 million yen, supplemented by approximately 750,000 yen more in public donations, but only after the scale of the disparity became a genuine public embarrassment for the government. Nakamura died in 1979, just 5 years after his surrender, and remains largely forgotten outside specialist historical accounts. He was, by the documented record, the actual last man still fighting World War II anywhere in the world, and almost nobody outside dedicated military history circles knows his name today. Onoda and Nakamura were never isolated, freakish cases. On the island of Guam alone, roughly 130 Japanese stragglers remained hidden at the moment of the formal 1945 surrender, following a period in which roughly 5,000 Japanese personnel had already been killed in the fighting that followed the island's recapture. Of those approximately 130 survivors, 114 eventually came in and surrendered over the following decades. More broadly across the Pacific theater, Nakamura was documented as the last of more than 120 individual stragglers rounded up across various islands in Indonesia and the wider Pacific between 1947 and 1974 alone. Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, discovered on Guam in January 1972 after approximately 28 years in hiding, had spent his own final years largely alone after his last surviving companions died around 1964, and he was greeted by a crowd of roughly 5,000 people upon his return to Japan, living until 1997. The underlying pattern across every one of these documented cases is remarkably consistent. Men trained, formally or informally, to treat surrender as both personally food and burning harvested rice as a calculated act of continued guerrilla warfare. That distinction is precisely why Onoda's case carries the moral weight it does in a way Yokoi's largely does not. Hiding from a war you believe is still happening is one thing. Continuing to actively wage that war against unarmed civilians, with the same tactical discipline a trained intelligence officer would bring to any active combat operation, is something else entirely. The Nakano School trained Onoda not simply to survive. It trained him to remain operational, and for 29 years, operational is exactly what he stayed. Even within Japan itself, Onoda's 1974 return didn't produce the unanimous, uncomplicated hero's welcome that's often simply assumed today. Historian Naoko Shiryu has described him as a man who was simultaneously regarded as a victim of the very system that had trained and shaped him, and criticized as a living embodiment of exactly the militarism that much of post-war Japanese society was actively trying to move beyond. Japan's political right embraced him as concrete proof of unbroken national loyalty and discipline carried across a generation. A large share of the political left saw, instead, a casualty of total indoctrination, a man whose entire adult identity had been constructed, almost from scratch, by a training program with no built-in exit condition and no mechanism for recognizing its own completion. Historian Beatrice Trefalt, whose broader scholarship covers Japanese stragglers and the politics of war memory in Japan between 1950 and 1975, has described Onoda's reception in terms that capture exactly this discomfort. For most Japanese observers at the time, he was admirable only in the most acutely uncomfortable way. Early 1970s Japan was a society actively, deliberately distancing itself from the old militarist regime, building an entire post-war national identity around pacifism and economic reconstruction rather than martial endurance. Onoda's return forced that society to confront a living, breathing embodiment of precisely the values it had spent nearly 3 decades trying to leave behind. Discipline so total it had outlasted the institution that demanded it by 29 years. There was no comfortable way to fully celebrate that without also implicitly endorsing the system that produced it. His later life reflected this exact same underlying tension in concrete, personal terms. His wife Machi eventually became head of a conservative Japanese women's association founded by Nippon Kaigi, an influential nationalist organization within Japanese politics, and his memorial service at Yasukuni Shrine, a site itself closely associated with Japan's wartime legacy and a recurring, ongoing source of regional diplomatic friction with both China and South Korea, placed him, even in death, directly at the center of the same ideological debate his entire life had come to embody. There's a recognizable shape to this kind of split public reception, and it shows up well outside the field of military history. It's structurally similar to how modern organizations handle a high-performing individual whose specific methods later come under serious scrutiny. The people who benefited from the output tend to defend the personal discipline and the measurable results, while the people who actually bore the cost of those methods focus entirely, and understandably, on the harm done. Both groups, in nearly every such case, are looking at the exact same underlying set of facts. They're simply weighting different parts of that same factual record. In the decades since his 2014 death, Hiroo Onoda's story has been retold repeatedly across multiple media, and almost every major retelling has leaned toward the romantic, heroic version rather than toward the fuller, more uncomfortable one this account has tried to present. French director Arthur Harari released Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, in 2021, a nearly 3-hour feature film that opened the prestigious Uncertain Regard section at the Cannes Film Festival on July 7th of that year. The film was based primarily on a 1974 biography written by Bernard Sindrin and Gerard Chenu, rather than directly on Onoda's own self-authored memoir, and it received strong critical reception overall, roughly 97% positive ratings across major film critics, with an average score sitting around 7.5 out of 10, and a Metacritic score of 78 out of 100 indicating generally favorable reviews. Harari has himself publicly acknowledged that the real Onoda he encountered through years of direct research for the project was considerably darker than the legend the film ultimately portrays on screen, closer, in his own stated description, to a sociopath than to a tragic, sympathetic hero. Critics reviewing the film also widely noted that it's told almost entirely from Onoda's own perspective throughout, with very little voice or screen time given to the Filipino islanders whose lives intersected with his for nearly 3 decades. Werner Herzog took his own separate pass at the same material with a 2021 novel titled The Twilight World, a literary treatment several critics have specifically argued perpetuates the heroic myth even further, rendering the Filipino islanders themselves almost entirely anonymous within the text, described only in broad, generic terms such as peasants, rather than as the specific, named individuals whose surviving families still live with the direct consequences of those decades today. The corrective record is still actively being built. Mia Stewart's documentary project, Searching for Onoda, has been in production for roughly 15 years and is structured specifically around centering the Filipino victims and their surviving families, rather than centering Onoda's own self-authored account of events. Stewart is also working separately to translate and publish ghostwriter Suda Shin's far more critical book into English, with the explicit permission of Suda's own surviving sons. As of the most recent available reporting, the project remained in its final stages of production. On Lubang Island itself today, there's now a tourist attraction known as the Onoda Trail and Caves, an 8-kilometer network of his former hideouts that opened to visitors around 2010, alongside a Philippine-Japan friendship shrine located near the area where Kozuka was killed. There's, notably and pointedly, no memorial anywhere on the island for Onoda's Filipino victims, and that specific gap is what Stewart's project is explicitly trying to close. The island itself has changed enormously since 1974, where roughly 12,000 people lived under the threat of Onoda's continued guerrilla activity. The combined municipalities of Lubang and Luk are now home to roughly 28,000 residents, a population more than doubled, living on an island now defined in tourism material primarily by the very man who once terrorized it. The Onoda Trail markets the romantic survival narrative to visitors walking the same caves where civilians were once ambushed. The economic legacy and the human cost occupy the exact same physical ground, and very few visitors walking that trail today are likely aware of Emilio Viano, Pelagio Tegel, Rafael Canals, or Francisco Villar. It's worth distinguishing, briefly, between the popular retellings and the academic record, because they've moved in noticeably different directions over time. Beatrice Trefalt's scholarly study of Japanese army stragglers, published in the early 2000s, was among the first sustained academic efforts to place Onoda's case inside the broader, Messier context of Japan's post-war memory politics rather than treating him as an isolated curiosity. Stephen Mercado's institutional history of the Nakano School similarly approached Onoda not as an inexplicable outlier, but as the predictable output of a specific, documented training doctrine, which is precisely the lens this account has tried to use throughout. Historian Yasukuni Igarashi's broader work on Japan's lost soldiers situates men like Onoda, Yokoi, and Nakamura inside a larger national story about delayed reckoning, a country that spent decades avoiding a full accounting of its wartime conduct, for which returning stragglers became, almost by accident, living test cases the public couldn't avoid confronting. What's notable is that none of this serious scholarship treats Onoda's 29 years as primarily a story of personal heroism. It treats it as a case study in institutional failure, a training doctrine without an expiration date, a verification protocol with exactly one accepted input, and a national government slow to reckon honestly with what its own systems had produced. The popular film, the popular novel, and the popular memory of Onoda diverge from that scholarly consensus almost completely, which is itself worth noting as you watch how this story continues to get told in the years ahead. Two readings of Hiroo Onoda sit side by side here, and the available evidence never fully settles which one is accurate. One reading casts him as the disciplined intelligence officer faithfully executing orders that simply never specified a clear end condition. The other casts him as the man who, by his own ghostwriter's direct account, and by the documented technology sitting in his own possession from 1965 onward, almost certainly understood the war had ended years before 1974 and kept killing regardless. A documentary that pretended this question was settled would be repeating exactly the same since it's criticizing the popular myth for committing. What the evidence does clearly support is this. Onoda's Nakano School training built a closed, internally consistent logical system. Distrust all enemy-sourced information by default. Never surrender without direct, verified, in-person contact from your own named chain of command. Remain alive and operational indefinitely. And that system functioned exactly as it was designed to function for 29 consecutive years. Whatever Onoda privately believed about the war's actual status at any given point along the way, his training gave him a structural, internally consistent justification to keep acting on his original 1944 orders regardless of what he may have privately suspected. That's not, and shouldn't be treated as, an excuse. It's an explanation, and the two are categorically not the same thing. The roughly 30 Filipino civilians killed during those 29 years paid the actual, physical price for a training doctrine that prioritized institutional obedience over any form of independent verification, and for a man who, by the account of the person who arguably knew the real story best, made a sustained, repeated choice to keep that doctrine running long after he had real reason to question it. It's worth being precise about what each interpretation actually requires you to believe, because they carry very different moral weight, even though they describe nearly identical behavior on the surface. The rational actor reading requires believing that a highly intelligent, highly trained man genuinely couldn't construct, on his own, a workable internal standard for what would count as sufficient evidence that a global war had ended, not after one leaflet. Not after his own family's photographs, not after a decade, not even after listening to a man walk on the moon. The deliberate perpetrator reading requires believing that the same man chose, repeatedly, year after year, to maintain a fiction that let him keep killing rather than face whatever reckoning awaited him on the other side of admitting the obvious. Both readings are uncomfortable. Both are defensible from the documented record. And the discomfort of not being able to fully resolve it is, itself, probably closer to the truth than either clean version on its own. There's one more detail worth sitting with before this story ends. and it concerns Taniguchi, not Onoda. The order that kept Onoda fighting for 29 years was, in its original form, simple and almost casual in its phrasing. Stay alive. Keep leading whoever remains under your command. Will eventually come back for you. Nobody in December 1944, including the man who personally gave that order, anticipated it would still be technically active in March 1974. Taniguchi himself spent those intervening decades living an entirely ordinary civilian life as a bookseller. He didn't spend those 30 years actively searching for Onoda, planning any kind of rescue mission, or treating the original order as a standing, unfulfilled personal obligation that weighed on him daily. For Taniguchi, the order was effectively over the moment Japan formally surrendered in 1945. For Onoda, it never was, not until Taniguchi physically stood in front of him on that runway and said so directly, in person. That fundamental asymmetry between an order that had effectively meant nothing further to the man who originally gave it, and an order that meant absolutely everything to the man who received it and carried it for 3 decades, is the actual core mechanism running underneath this entire story. It was never really about propaganda Onoda simply couldn't see through, or about a fanatic too deluded to recognize obvious evidence. It was about a verification protocol with exactly one accepted form of valid input, issued by an institutional system that never once anticipated actually needing to use that protocol almost 30 years later. Consider what this means in practical terms for the design of any system that issues standing instructions and then walks away. Taniguchi's order wasn't unreasonable at the moment he gave it. In December 1944, with the war's outcome genuinely uncertain and a real possibility that organized Japanese forces might return to Lubang within a few years as promised, the order became unreasonable only retroactively, only once the underlying conditions that justified it had permanently changed in a way the order itself contained no mechanism for detecting. This isn't a uniquely military failure. It's a structural failure that recurs anywhere a standing instruction is issued without a built-in review date, a default expiration, or a clearly defined condition under which the instruction itself should be questioned rather than simply obeyed. Onoda's case is simply the most extreme, most costly, and best documented version of that failure that history happens to have produced. Hiroo Onoda fought a war that ended for the rest of the world on August 15, 1945, and that ended for him specifically on March 9, 1974, 28 years, 6 months, and 8 days later, when the one single form of evidence his training allowed him to formally accept finally arrived in person, standing on an airstrip in front of him. In that gap, in those intervening decades, roughly 30 people who had absolutely nothing to do with the war Onoda believed he was still actively fighting lost their lives, and more than 100 more were wounded. He wasn't even the last Japanese soldier to surrender. That distinction belongs to Teruo Nakamura, a man history has largely forgotten, treated worse by his own government, and remembered by almost nobody. 2 competing legacies now exist for the same 29 years on the same small island. One legacy is told through Onoda's own memoir, through Werner Herzog's novel, through a celebrated film that opened at Cannes, through a survival school in Fukushima Prefecture, through medals from the Brazilian Air Force, and through an 8-kilometer tourist trail winding through the caves where he once hid. The other legacy exists in 6 death certificates held by a documentary filmmaker who is also this story's victim's relative, in the testimony of a son who outlived his father's killer by decades before dying in a pandemic, in a daughter who was 6 years old when she found her own father decapitated, and in a town council's unanswered request for compensation that was made directly to Onoda's face in 1996 and never fulfilled. Both legacies are accurate. Only one of them has a major film, a best-selling memoir, and a tourist trail attached to it. The question this story ultimately leaves behind isn't really about one soldier's extraordinary, decades-long personal discipline. It's about what happens when an institution deliberately builds a system designed to survive absolutely any condition except the one it actually, eventually needed to survive, the system being told, clearly, directly, and finally, that it's over. Onoda waited 29 years for exactly one man to walk up to him in person and say the words that finally ended it. The real question worth sitting with is how many other systems, institutions, or deeply held beliefs are still quietly running today, for no other reason than that nobody who originally built them has ever shown up to say the same thing.